So thank you all for being here. I know it's late in the day of a lot of webinars, so a very warm welcome to all of you and thank you for joining us today. My name is Amita Ramchandran and I'm the program lead of the India Climate Collaborative. For those of you who don't know us, the ICC, as we refer to it, is India's first ever collective response to climate change by business and philanthropy. The ICC is proud to be the host of the climate track at Charcha 2020, of which this is a panel. And we thank the Nudge Foundation for bringing us all together today. For many of us in the climate community, the widespread feelings of global helplessness that we've been feeling in the face of COVID-19 is oddly familiar. There are concerning similarities between these two planetary crises. With climate change, as with COVID-19, only in retrospect will we understand the extent of damage we caused by not acting sooner. Climate change, like COVID-19, has and will continue to disproportionately burden our poorest communities, exacerbating economic and social shocks, and leading to huge economic losses and wide-scale migration. But there is also differences in these two crises, and we have the opportunity to use this forced pause to consider what parts of our previous life we want to rebuild and what parts we can reimagine. So to tell us more about the technical, social, and political responses needed to enhance our climate action after the pandemic, we're joined by a truly remarkable panel moderated by one of India's climate leaders, Dr. Arunabha Ghosh. Dr. Ghosh is a public policy professional, advisor, author, TED speaker, columnist, and institution builder. He is the founder CEO of the Council on Energy, Environment, and Water, one of South Asia's leading policy research institutions, and our stellar session partners for this event. Arunabha, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Amita. And it's a real pleasure for CEEW to partner with the India Climate Collaborative. We are here in unprecedented times, not just because of the pandemic we are facing, but also because of the climate crisis we have in our hands. And the question before all of us is can the lessons of the pandemic help us move forward with the action that we need on climate change? Or will the crisis of the pandemic hold us back from the more urgent action that we need on more chronic risks that climate change presents to us? Think about this. We are dealing with a major public health crisis. We are dealing with millions of people infected by a virus and several tens of thousands of deaths. But over the last 20 years, about 500,000 lives were lost between 1999 and 2018, thanks to extreme weather events resulting from climate change. India alone over the last 3 decades has encountered about 300 extreme weather events, most of which have happened after 2005, causing about $80 billion of damages in India alone. But consider this, despite a global lockdown of all major economies, the estimates that we currently have suggest that we are going to have a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions this year in 2020 of about 5.5%. Now that is the steepest reduction that we would have experienced on record. And yet, that still falls short of the 7.6% year-on-year reductions in emissions that is necessary to keep the planet on a track that would limit the temperature rise to under 1.5 degrees Celsius. So clearly shutting down our economic activity, losing lives and livelihoods is not going to be sufficient. And yet the kind of crises and shocks that climate change will present to us requires a very different order of effort. So the acuteness of the current pandemic perhaps offers us some lessons on how we deal with more chronic crises. We are intentionally bringing about this conversation today to talk a little bit beyond the usual responses of energy efficiency here and renewable energy there. Of course, India has done a lot, sometimes disproportionately more compared to other countries when you adjust for income levels in these two areas. And yet a lot more needs to be done, not just by India, but by the rest of the world as well. And that's why we are privileged to have an extraordinary set of people who are not just talking about this issue, but actually driving action against tail-end risks of climate change in a range of areas. They will bring perspectives from rural development and sustainable agriculture, from disaster management, from nudging social action and attention on climate change, to talking about international negotiations or even how to bring countries together to deal with a collective crisis with collective action. Let me quickly introduce our stellar panel, and then we will move on to hearing from each one of them. I will interject each of the presentations with a few follow-up questions. I hope you will share your questions on the chat window so that later in the conversation, we can come back to the panel with some of the questions that you have posed. Professor Sir David King is currently the chair of the Center for Climate Repair at Cambridge University and was previously chief scientific advisor to the UK government. He's the emeritus professor of chemistry at the University of Cambridge, founder of the Center of Climate Repair, and a senior strategy advisor to the president of Rwanda. He was also founding director of the Smith School of Enterprise and Environment at Oxford. That was the first time I encountered David. Head of the Department of Chemistry at Cambridge, Master of Downing College at Cambridge. He served as UK's chief scientific advisor from 2000 to 2007. And if you want to know how to deal with pandemics, well, he dealt with several rounds of pandemics earlier when the century began. But the reason David is on this panel is because of his more recent efforts, not just on the research side, but to bring countries together to focus on climate risks. From 2014 onwards, I had the privilege of collaborating with David on a global assessment of climate risks, which we published just before the Paris climate negotiations. In fact, we launched that document in the London and the Bombay stock exchanges to drive home the message to investors, not just governments and philanthropists, to investors and business persons about the risks that climate change poses. We will hear from David in a short while about a new initiative that he's trying to drive across the world. Mr. Kamal Kishore is member of the National Disaster Management Authority, but is also in charge of the secretariat that is dealing with the new initiative that India has brought forward for the world called the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure. Mr. Kishore has worked on disaster risk reduction and recovery for more than 2 decades. Prior to joining the NDMA, he worked with UNDP for nearly 13 years in New Delhi, Geneva, and in headquarters in New York. At UNDP headquarters, he led global advocacy campaigns to address disaster risk reduction concerns in the UN Sustainable Development Goals. He has supported post-disaster recovery in many countries, not just in India, including Bangladesh, Indonesia, Iran, Myanmar, Pakistan, Philippines, and Sri Lanka. Mr. Vijay Kumar is currently vice chairman of the Rythu Sadhikara Samstha, which is based in Andhra Pradesh. It is the body that is spearheading this major initiative on natural farming in the state of Andhra Pradesh, but which is also the world's largest such program under action. Mr. Vijay Kumar is a champion of rural development. In nearly 4 decades of government service, he spent 25 years in large-scale community mobilization with tribal communities, rural women, and farmers. He spent a record 10 years from 2000 to 2010 as the CEO of the Society for Elimination of Rural Poverty and led the mobilization and empowerment of 11.5 million rural poor women in Andhra Pradesh. And that's the basis that of women coming together, self-help groups, which has helped Andhra Pradesh move forward and leverage its initiative on natural farming. Ms. Sujatha Kulshreshtha is the founder of Wide Angle Films and director and producer of India 2050, a recent documentary she produced for Discovery Channel, on which I had the privilege of featuring with a few stark thoughts on my end. Sujatha is the founder of Wide Angle Films, a video production house based in India. She has had clients including Discovery Channel, History TV, UNICEF, and World Bank, and has won several international awards for documentaries done by her production house. India 2050, the film that she recently produced, was commissioned by Discovery and is a cold, stark, dystopian snapshot of what India can become if we don't wake up to the threat of climate change now. I will also introduce our final speaker, Mr. Ravi Shankar Prasad, who is currently in a meeting with the Minister of Environment and Forests and has said that he will join as soon as his meeting ends. Mr. Ravi Shankar Prasad is the Additional Secretary at the Ministry of Environment, Forests and Climate Change and represents India as the chief negotiator in climate negotiations. Those of you who are familiar with climate negotiations and India's positions will know the deep knowledge that Mr. Ravi Shankar Prasad brings to the subject. He is a member of the Indian Administrative Service from the Assam Meghalaya cadre and has served the government of India in key positions, including in the ministries of finance, tourism, labor, employment, and forests. So with that introduction and that context, let me now turn to each of the speakers to present for 5 to 7 minutes their initial big idea on what can we do on climate change in the post-pandemic world. So David King, I'm going to start with you. If you could unmute yourself, Dave.
Arunabha, first of all, let me thank you for inviting me to this critically important meeting and to be on this panel with such a range of outstanding people. I want to start by just underlining what you've said and then develop my theme. In the case of both epidemics and climate change, prevention would have been much more affordable than delay. Both contexts, seemingly small changes at an invisible scale cause exponential rates of change with deadly results. So this is what I think is the lesson we need to take away from this pandemic. Let me just quickly explain why it is I've changed my position from 5 years ago. Since that time, global climate change impacts have severely increased. And I just give you the examples of what's happening at the poles and the Himalayas, the melting of ice. What we have seen at the North Pole is the loss of Arctic summer sea ice to the point where half of the ocean, for the first time in hundreds of thousands of years, is now exposed to sunlight. And the Arctic Circle region as a whole is now heating up at about 2.5 times the rate of the rest of the planet. Why does that threaten everybody? Precisely because Greenland is sitting right there in that Arctic Circle. And as all of the ice on Greenland melts, global sea levels on average will rise by 7 meters. That is already beginning to happen, and it looks as if it's beginning to happen irreversibly. And although this will take a time, it is likely, if we add what's happening in the Antarctic and the Himalayas as well, that the global sea levels will be rising not by 0.5 meter, but by several meters at least before the end of the century. India has a coastline which is very much a threat from this. Many of your cities sitting on your coastline. And I would have to tell you from that analysis that we did together, Arunabha and I, we noted that Calcutta is perhaps the world's greatest city that will no longer be feasible as a city due to frequent flooding as we move forward. As sea levels rise, again, it's extreme weather events that provide the biggest challenge. So in other words, where we are today at greenhouse gas levels, if I top up with methane as well, it's about 500 parts per million carbon dioxide equivalent, and the temperature rise is 1.2 degrees centigrade, it's already too high. So what we agreed in Paris, although we don't look as if we've taken it seriously, of 1.5 being the limit, is already too high. So this is why I've changed the approach to introduce this phrase, climate repair. And under the heading of climate repair, I put 3 objectives. So let me state the objectives as clearly as I can. The first, we will not survive as a civilization if we continue emitting at roughly 40 billion tons of greenhouse gases a year, which is where we are today. We need deep and rapid emissions reduction. So everything I say is contextualized around the continued need for deep and rapid emissions reduction. But in addition, number 2, we need to remove greenhouse gases that we've already put up in the atmosphere. 500 parts per million, far too much. 350 parts per million is the target in the project to remove greenhouse gases. And I haven't got the time to go into the details of what we're doing here in Cambridge, but around the world, there are groups now working on technologies and imitation of natural processes that would be capable, we believe, when put together, of removing about 30 to 40 billion tons of greenhouse gases a year from the atmosphere. And what we need is to roll out experiments that enable us to check whether there will be any adverse effect from any of these impacts. One of these, let me just mention my favorite, is to imitate what happens when the wind blows over the Sahara Desert, say in North Africa. It picks up very small dust particles, creates a dust storm. The dust storm blows over the Atlantic Ocean. When the wind dies, it peppers the ocean with these small dust particles, which contain iron, that stimulates a greening of that area of the sea, perhaps 100 square kilometers at a time. And within a few months, that becomes a sea forest with literally billions of fish. The whales of the world come flocking there, and in one mouthful, they will take 1 million fish. We believe we can restore the oceans to their original state of being a living area. At the moment, most of our oceans are deserts, by simply dusting the surface of the ocean with iron salt particles. And that's what we want to check out. And with that alone, we could well remove about 25 to 30 billion tons of greenhouse gases a year. The third part of this is to return back to where I started with the state of the Arctic, the Antarctic, and the Himalayas. We need to actually do experiments and work on whether we can find technologies to refreeze the poles and refreeze the Himalayas. We all know what a loss to the Chinese and Indian fertility, the fertile soil would be if the spring runoff of water from the Himalayas was to terminate. So this is not only a sea level rise issue, it's also an issue of agriculture. So those are the three elements of climate repair. Now, how do we achieve this? First of all, we're talking to universities around the world, and here I am addressing people in India. Please join us to set up hubs on climate repair. And then we can work internationally to pull the work together. We're happy to act as an international hub here in Cambridge, but if anyone else wants to take on that role, we would be delighted to hand it over. Secondly, and this is, I think, more important in a way, is to look at what has happened in the COP process. Since 1992, we have made one major step of progress. 2015, the final agreement was reached on managing climate change. 1.5 degrees centigrade target. When we add up the nationally determined contributions, we all know, not even close. So we said we're going to review this within 5 years. That is due this year. It's now due to take place in Glasgow, COP26. It's been removed to next year. I think the British government was keen to see it was in May or June next year, but the negotiations with the United Nations mean it may take place later in the year, after August next year. This gives us a bit more time to sort out what we do, but I'm not placing any hope in 197 nations delivering what we need to do. So what I'm suggesting and proposing and trying to move people around the world is that we create an alliance of nations, which we would call the Global Climate Alliance of Nations and States. And the reason I add the phrase states is we've been in discussions with heads of states in the United States. And I believe the Climate Alliance of States in the United States is now about 25 or 26 states, representing about 60% of the American economy. These are states that want to take action on climate change. And what we want is the Global Climate Alliance to agree to act under this heading, climate repair, and support all three aspects of climate repair. So why would I feel at all optimistic about this? On the first day of the Paris meeting in 2015, we had all of the heads of governments present. And outside the main area, the main tent, we had an external meeting inviting all members who were committed to an action called Mission Innovation to commit themselves to spending $30 billion a year of public money on research and development into clean energy technologies. Was that successful? Yes, we had these 22 heads of government under the banner Mission Innovation lined up for a wonderful photograph. The European Union joined as well. And this year we are spending $22 to $23 billion amongst those nations on these new technologies. There was a success. It was not part of the COP process. Those people were there for the COP meeting. And I don't want to destroy COP. It's a great place for everyone to meet, but I do think the real action is going to happen outside the COP. So I want to call for nations to send their heads of government, states of countries where the federal government is not in favor, as is currently the case in the United States, to join us under that umbrella of climate repair and commit countries to this program. That is the proposal I want to put forward for discussion, Arunabha, and thank you for giving me the chance.
Thank you, David. You've kicked us off with a big idea. And, just going back to Mission Innovation, I know in the early ideas, early avatars of that idea, we were calling it the Global Apollo Program to kind of reflect what the world could do together. In fact, the same day when Mission Innovation was launched, India also spearheaded under that same tent the International Solar Alliance, along with France, which now has more than 80 member countries. So I agree with you. We don't need all 197 to get action going. So that leads me to turn to Mr. Kamal Kishore. You've just heard, Sir David, Kamal, and in the United Nations, there is some wariness about using the term natural disasters, because many of these disasters that look like natural disaster actually because of human actions. You're a member of the National Disaster Management Agency, but also leading the Secretariat for the Coalition of Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, another push by India to bring together other countries to work on this. How is disaster management institutional architecture in India preparing itself for the non-linear climate risks?
That's a very big question, Arunabha. I think since this meeting is happening in the context of COVID-19, let me highlight a few lessons that are coming out of it, early lessons, which will inform our work to prepare for disasters of the future. And as you said, there are no natural disasters, they're all man-made. There are natural events, but they turn into disasters only because of human actions. I want to highlight 3 points. The first point I want to say is that there are black swans everywhere. We are only 20 years into this century, and we've had 3 disasters that have been a single disaster leading to loss of more than 100,000 lives. And unfortunately, COVID-19 is inching close to 100,000 as well. So in 20 years, we've had 4 events where we would have lost more than 100,000 people in a single event. And from all the scenarios, these are not the worst possible events. There could be even worse events. So I think that's, the whole thing that, I sort of begin to question the notion of low frequency, high impact event. When you look at the global scale and, in my own professional life, these seem to be more frequent than we have characterized them. The second thing to say here, Arunabha, is that we really are grappling in this COVID-19 management with the notion of how to deal with uncertainty. Those of us who work on disaster risk management, we work with risk models, We know the progression of injuries after an earthquake. There's a whole body of work on epidemiology of earthquakes. You can model how many people will be rendered homeless in a particular area if a cyclone of certain intensity strikes that place. But in this one, we are really living day to day. I mean, it sounds a little bit of an exaggeration, but it is really like this. By middle of March, the modeling market was really busy. There were so many epidemiological models giving all sorts of forecasts. All of them have been wrong. Some of them have been useful, but all of them have been wrong. And particularly when you go to the local level, I think there is a lot of variation.
Right.
So that brings me to my third point, which is that, there is the thing of aggregates and there is the thing of what really happens at the granular level. And there is a lot that happens between the occurrence of a hazardous event, in this case, the spread of the virus, and people getting affected. And that is intermediated by a lot of local factors. And that is a huge challenge. How do you really localize action while also having a global view of the problem? So those of us who work on traditional disaster risk management work have tried to do risk indices, try to stay ahead of the pandemic and try to predict, where it is going to go now. And it has been extremely challenging. The traditional risk assessment tools are not working as well as we thought they would. And basically, there are 2 or 3 characteristics there which are basically limiting them. One characteristic is that they are not nimble enough. They provide standard answers. They do not answer that are emanating from the field. The second thing is that they do not have the granularity that you need to be able to actually inform specific decision making. And of course, because of that, there is a lot of averaging and you lose a lot of detail and a lot of insight. So these are the 3 big things that are coming out. There are black swans everywhere. We have to get better at dealing with uncertainty, and we have to have much granular, much more sophisticated risk assessment tools at the local level. All of this learning will come in very handy when we deal with future surprises related to climate and adapt to those surprises. Thank you, Arunabha.
Thank you, Kamal. That's really helpful for you to kind of articulate the kind of challenge that we have to not just anticipate the black swan events, but have granular enough understanding to be able to build that resilience. Before I turn to the other speakers, I actually want to come back to both you and Sir David. Exactly for the reasons that you've been highlighting, at CEEW, one of the things we have been focusing on is trying to build a much more granular climate risk atlas for India. No developing country has something like this. We have global average assessments of climate vulnerability across the world, and you hear about that every time before we get to international negotiations, just before every COP. But getting to that granularity at a high resolution level is extremely important, both for disaster management, but also to build resilience. So one question to both of you. David, how without that granular understanding that world of uncertainty we are in, how can we even contemplate large planetary scale interventions of the kind that you were suggesting? Because some of the questions that are coming through on the chat box are suggesting, that wouldn't it be irresponsible to do it at that scale without knowing what the local level implications might be? And I know you've thought a lot about this, so would love to hear your questions on this. And Kamal, the question to you is, because we are making decisions on uncertainty, what is the minimum information that you need? Because we can keep getting granular by the year, but what is the minimum you need to make a difference between where we are today versus where we could be at least within the next half a decade to build up more resilience?
Arunabha, thank you for the question. Let me quickly say, when it comes to climate change, in addition to mitigation, in addition to climate repair, we do, of course, need adaptation. We all know what's coming down the road more generally, but granularity is critically important in the area of adaptation. So if I can just give you the advice I'm giving to the very small country of Rwanda, tiny proportion compared with India of the world's surface. Rwanda actually sits right between, on the one hand, the Congo side, and on the other hand, the East Africa side. And on the East Africa side, they're faced with increasing drought, and on the other side, increasing rainfall. And so both of them provide massive risks to local populations. The increased rainfall, of course, massive flood risk, but they're also now, because the rainfall has increased so significantly, losing topsoil very dramatically. And since the country depends for its survival on farming, it means that this is a very serious challenge to their survivability. And on the other side, where there's drought, again, farming is at risk, but this time from loss of water. Now, all of this is the granular scale of a single small country in Africa. So you're quite right, granularity critically important. But if I step back from that and say, then what are the global issues? How can we discuss this at a global scale, as you're asking me? Then I said, but all of this is driven by greenhouse gases in the atmosphere being far higher. Today, 500 parts per million, pre-industrial level, 270 parts per million, all due to fossil fuel usage and due to the loss of forests. Then we know that we have taken that too far, and every country is impacted by that single phenomenon. So I think when I talk about climate repair and I pull in the Himalayas, it's not just the two poles that are severely at risk. Himalayas are losing a lot of ice each year. We're looking at what are the grand scale things that are impacting every country.
Arunabha, in terms of what is the bare minimum you need in terms of granularity, I have two. I'll answer that in two parts. The first is the quantitative side. On the quantitative side, I think it is really very simple and basic. Simple data hygiene on all the development parameters, where you have health clinics, what capacity is available, interoperability of different data sets at different administrative levels. So the general boring, tedious stuff of building a good system of data hygiene and statistical system in any country. But beyond that, from a risk perspective, it is really important to have your ear to the ground and understand what are the local drivers of risk. For example, in case of COVID-19, local mobility patterns are a driver of risk. But local mobility is not the same in Bombay as it is in Delhi or it is in Kolkata. So, and how does it do that? And how do you quickly understand that and feed that into your risk assessment? So that constant dialogue with local level actors, you almost need a local level risk lab, which understands the local level dynamics that leads to generation of risk. There is no shortcut to that.
That's right, Kamal. At CEEW, again, we had tried to downscale the models and develop risk assessments for individual cities, Gwalior in Madhya Pradesh, for instance, or Amravati in Andhra Pradesh. But unless that data can then be used by a local level authority, it becomes challenging. But this is the moment to also formally welcome Mr. Ravi Shankar Prasad. Mr. Prasad, thank you so much for joining us immediately after your official meetings. I have formally introduced you before at the beginning of the session, but let me just say this, at CEEW, we've been ranked as among the leading climate think tanks in the world. But every time we have a meeting with Mr. Prasad, we're always worried, have we prepared enough compared to how much he knows on the subject? So Mr. Prasad, we started off this conversation with the kind of crisis we are facing, both with the pandemic, but also with climate change. And Sir David was referring back to 2015 when a subset of countries came together to launch with a mission innovation, or India launched the International Solar Alliance. Between then and now, trust in the formal negotiations process seems to have diluted because some major economies have stepped back from their commitments. And yet, as you see the urgency of climate change presented to a vulnerable country like India, where do you see, will India continue to pursue its Paris goals, ramp up the ambition? We look forward to you for your initial thoughts, Mr. Prasad. Thank you for joining again.
Thank you, Dr. Ghosh. And in fact, I'm sorry to join you all late today because of another engagement that I had. But I heard the intervention or the articulations of Dr. Kamal Kishore. And it's wonderful to be part of this discussion. We are all trying to negotiate the COVID pandemic now. And the kind of dislocations, social distress, loss of job, etc., that we are seeing has really brought out the fact that, again, it has driven home the point again that we live in an interconnected world and we all are dependent on each other. And the same holds true for the climate crisis. Going or looking beyond negotiations, I'll come back to the point that Dr. Ghosh asked me to dwell upon, but going beyond the negotiations, I think that this crisis has taught us the value of subsisting or surviving on less. And it has taught us the value of nature. It has taught us that we can reduce our consumptions, and consumption emissions, as we all know, have been one of the biggest sources of greenhouse gas emissions. And this gives us a chance to re-look at some of the things that we dwelt upon in Paris, like sustainable patterns of consumption and production, sustainable lifestyles, and try to reorient our future growth patterns on these basic issues, reduce the demand for inessentials, and also try to look at alternative ways of doing things. Coming to the negotiations, we are all aware that there have been issues with some countries not doing enough, some countries regressing back on their promises, but overall, the global mood has been ambitious. There have been positive optimists. And I also feel that a lot can be achieved by the group of countries who have really been in the forefront of the climate challenge. If we look at how countries have performed, both in terms of the Kyoto Protocol commitments and the Paris Agreement future commitments, we find that some countries are on track. Countries like India are doing more than what they had promised, and we are on track to achieve our goals. But we all know that the developing world has certain expectations, and we need to look at some of the challenges that they face, especially on the front of technology transfers, on the front of finance. These supports are required and will be required in the post-COVID world also. So they will remain some of the top challenges that we have. And of course, adaptation, the requirement for adaptation is something that we have to address. We have to look at new ways of doing our infrastructure development in terms of developing climate resilient facilities. And that would remain some of the work to be done post-pandemic. And how do we channelize our investments? How do we channelize our priorities in the post-COVID world will be important. But As far as the Paris goals are concerned, India is committed. India stands firmly behind the Paris Agreement. And we find that in general, there is a consensus on the fact that the Paris Agreement must succeed. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Prasad. Before I turn to Mr. Vijay Kumar and Ms. Kulshreshtha, let me get your initial thoughts, reactions to something that Sir David proposed in his opening remarks. Notwithstanding the mitigation actions that many countries are taking, some more than others, we still have a situation where the likely sea level rise is going to be several meters rather than the originally estimated just half a meter during the course of the century. A country like India with a long coastline will be particularly vulnerable. We know that. We've written about it. So the proposition was that could a smaller or a subset of nations come together, nations and sub-regional actors come together for what Sir David proposed as a global climate repair project, or an alliance of nations working on climate repair with large-scale carbon dioxide removal attempts being part of that initiative. What would be, I will bring Sir David into the conversation in a bit again, but what would be your initial thoughts around the need to basically get carbon out of the atmosphere, not just prevent more carbon getting into the atmosphere?
Definitely, that's an important approach to tackling the crisis. And various experiments are being made in different parts of the world, including in India. And we would be happy to associate with such endeavors in the coming days. I would just like to highlight that India in the recent days has formulated a specific mission on coastal areas, which is to be launched shortly. And also we are doing a project with the World Bank, which was earlier known as ICZMP, Integrated Coastal Zonal Management Plan. But this time it has got a bigger focus on the climate risk and vulnerabilities and addressing the challenge of climate change in the entire coastal stretch of India. That is about 7,500 square kilometers. So this second phase is going to be launched from this year, and it has a very large component on addressing the challenge of climate change.
Thank you, Mr. Prasad. Let me get in Mr. Vijay Kumar now. Mr. Vijay Kumar, even before you've begun making your interventions, a number of the questions that have come up are about what is the kind of recovery package, what is the society, what is the economy that we want to create in the post-COVID world. There are phrases like, is there an alternative economic plan? There are phrases like, can there be a V-shaped recovery if we had a greener economy for urban and rural India? You've been a champion of resilience in the rural sector. You've been an actor on the ground for 2 decades in just this area. So I want to ask you, from the perspective of the small and marginal farmer, how do they become more resilient against the numerous black swan events that Kamal was referring to earlier? Over to you, sir.
Yeah. Thank you, Arunabha. I think the COVID pandemic is a very rude wake-up call. As it is, the small and marginal farmers were under huge financial distress. And that is also what has led to the distress migration. And not only the farmers, the food system itself was under crisis. And as I see, Arunabha, there are 4 or even more emergencies which we are not taking very seriously. I hope someday we take it seriously. One is the financial distress of the farmers has been increasing over the last 2 decades especially. And the weather unpredictability and the water distress is going to add to their distress. At the same time, from a consumer point of view, the food that we are eating is ridden with chemicals, which is compromising our immunity and also lacks essential nutrients, which is because the way we are growing food is compromising on the nutrients in the food. as if these two are not enough, we also have a huge soil crisis. We have been losing soil, not only in India, but across the world. We have a huge water crisis, and there is a rapid loss of biodiversity. And accompanying global warming is going to make all these worse. And I don't even want to, speculate on what all can happen. And I leave it to Sujatha to talk about that. But what is very interesting, Arunabha, is what we are finding out is that the very agricultural practices that we have been promoting are themselves a cause of destruction or a cause of, leading to greenhouse gases getting into the air, whether it's deforestation, crop residue burning, ploughing, biocides. So we have agriculture and food system being devastated by climate change. At the same time, agriculture practices and the food system, current business as usual, is a big contributor to that. So in that context, we visualized that can farmers provide the solution? And it's a big yes. I think farmers, if we farm in harmony with nature, because we have to respect nature, and our agriculture technology, land management practices should actually repair nature. I think I'm very clear in my mind, and that's why I'm optimistic that farmers, collective action of farmers across the world can repair the planet much faster than any other engineering solution. I may be wrong, but I believe very strongly that we should be in harmony with nature and not compete or fight with nature. And I believe very strongly the 650,000 farmers of Andhra Pradesh who are practicing regenerative agriculture are showing the way, because they are able to make their farming more profitable. The food they are consuming, the food they are selling is more nutritious. And what I can see is this kind of agriculture is climate change resilient. It's building soil organic matter. It's increasing water retention. And all this is happening at a very low cost. Every farmer is then a partner in the climate repair process. It has to be done by every farmer, every square inch of land, every acre of land, and every acre of forest. So that is my the way I look at it. And because you see, nature already has shown us, over the last 420 million years when life on Earth started, how did nature create soil, create forests, create greenery? So we have to learn from that and mimic that. And what we are finding in the Indian context, what we are able to do with the technology, which is regenerative agriculture, or we call it as natural farming, we find that the role of soil microbes is very important, and the role of photosynthesis in bringing the carbon dioxide into liquid carbon, so putting it below the soil. And that is what nature has done. I mean, CO2 levels were much more higher in earlier era, but nature has shown a way of bringing down CO2 levels safely and increasing the soil organic matter through these agriculture practices, according to me, represents the best bet for addressing climate change, for addressing farmers' profitability, addressing health and nutrition, and the, ensuring restoration of biodiversity. And but this is happening at a very slow pace, Arunabha. So what we require is basically very disruptive ways of doing it so that this can accelerate. So that is what we are working on. We have actually 3-4 disruptions combined are enabling us in a very short period of time. We have actually reached 10% of the farmers, whereas the whole world is only at 0.5% of farmers practicing climate resilient principles.
Yeah.
So there has to be a disruption in the kind of knowledge that goes to farmers, disruption in the extension system, and farming knowledge and this change strategy has to be more women-centric. Women farmers, we find, are more, for this kind of change. And we also need the incentives, the financial structures, financial restructuring to enable this to happen. This can happen very fast. And I think it's a proven technology in the hands of people. It's a green technology and with multiple benefits. We have estimated that 1 rupee invested in this transformation brings about 13 rupees benefit to farmers and at least 5-10 times more benefits in ecosystem services. So I'll just conclude by saying that we believe very strongly that farmers practicing regenerative agriculture are gods, multiple gods. They feed us, Annadata. They give us good health because the food is nutritious, God of health. And we have developed a mechanism, Arunabha, which is able to harness water vapor from the air for irrigation. Yeah. So in that sense, farmers have become rain gods. And by addressing climate change issues, I think farmers can save the planet. And women farmers, and in India, 55% of rural households are dependent on agriculture. So there cannot be a solution without farmers and women being at the center of it. Just one last comment. The COVID pandemic also tells us that food has to be more nutritious. So therefore, the way we produce food is important. It also tells us value chains have to be shorter. So how do you promote local markets? That becomes important. And how do you bring urban consumers in touch with the rural producers? So we need to have different disruptive ways of bringing the two together in marketing also. So I'll just conclude by saying that I believe very strongly in nature-based solutions. UN itself has recommended nature-based solutions. And I believe very strongly that every citizen on earth should be a partner in this process. It's not something which technologies alone can solve in the absence of citizens. Citizen action, either as producers or as consumers, is critical for this transformation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Vijay Kumar. And we've been privileged to be independently evaluating the program that you're running in Andhra Pradesh. Our latest work on fertilizer use, as you know, found that if the farmers moved completely away from chemical fertilizers, just the fertilizer subsidies would come down by about $300 million each year for just the state of Andhra Pradesh, and could pay for the entire shift towards natural farming within 7 to 8 years. But the point about nature-based solutions is also something I know that the UK government has put forward quite strongly in its dialogues and deliberations with other countries leading up to whenever COP26 happens. But you talked about the role of citizens. So let me turn to Sujatha Kulshreshtha, who is a filmmaker, but you're also a lay citizen. You're not a so-called climate expert. You're not a climate modeler. And I want to ask you, what made you want to make a film on climate risks? And what did you learn in the process? Once we hear from you, there are a lot of questions that have come from the listeners, and I want to come back to all the panelists with a bunch of questions that I want to pose to you in the last 20 minutes. So Sujatha, 5 minutes to you.
Thanks, Arunabha. I'd like to say I'm honored to be part of this panel, and I'm bringing a completely layperson perspective, just the way Arunabha said, because I'm a filmmaker. This particular project was one project that I did on climate change. But having said that, there was almost 3-4 months of research that went into making the film, and there were a lot of revelations that we as a team had, as well as I think there were revelations that we were able to pass on to our viewers through the film and through the communication. I'd also like to sort of say that as far as the COVID pandemic is concerned, I feel that it's really been an eye-opener from the point of view that there's so much of, these videos going around on social media that are showing the planet healing, that are showing, the sort of animals coming back, that are showing clean water bodies. So there is suddenly, there's obviously a lot of joy that people are deriving out of that. And I feel that one should use this opportunity to say to people that this is what we've lost, and it's really up to us to create this low carbon future, which is now pretty much in our hand. We've seen that by our stopping our vehicles out, by our working at home, we've been able to change so I think it's important to build upon the mindset, to build upon this opportunity that the pandemic has brought to us, and to bring about a behavioral sort of change in the way all of us think as citizens, and the fact that I think all of us do have a role to play. Yes, like all the sort of speakers on the panel have talked about the larger policy changes, the technological changes that can be brought about in climate change. Yet I feel the way Vijay Kumar ji said, that each of us as individuals, there is a role to play over there. There is a role in connecting back to the future. And I really feel that our daily choices, whether it's the amount we travel, whether it's the amount we travel to office, whether it's the amount we travel, on business, if we can change those choices by using the pandemic as a sort of as a base for our communication, I think that we have a very strong case to build upon. And I think it's a great time to reflect on these things. It's a great time to reinvent our cities, with these things. I think there are some cities in the US like Boston, etc. Also in Oakland, they've already sort of designated areas where no vehicles are allowed, where you're only allowed to walk, you're only allowed to cycle. So I think that these are things that we need to sort of start thinking again. Like I said, reinventing some of our cities, to imagine some of these, to reimagine some of these things, so that we can enjoy nature again and we can rebuild what we've sort of lost. And like I said, like Vijay Kumar ji said, that there is a lot as far as farmers are concerned. I'd like to cite an example from our film, because I think what we did in the film was, we found that climate change as an issue was really a large issue as far as a layperson is concerned. I know it's different, within your fraternity, but we found that global warming, climate change, I mean, these are terms that people are familiar with, but it's very abstract. It's very large. People don't know how to deal with it, how to connect with it, what they can do to change it. So again, like I said, completely as a layperson, we sort of address this by trying to connect the dots, across various issues for a layperson. So Vijay Kumar ji talked about the farmer. We shot in Punjab. We shot farmers in Punjab. And it was such an eye-opener for us from the point of view of the fact that in Punjab, it's become a very sort of intensive rice growing belt. Now, Punjab was originally not a rice growing belt because there wasn't enough rainfall there. But over a period of time, because we as consumers, the demand is high for rice, for good rice grown cheaply, we've moved away from West Bengal, from Kerala, which were sort of rain intensive areas, So to our horror, we found that, rice, 1 kg of rice in Punjab requires something like 500 liters of water to grow 1 kg of rice. So over a period of time, what has happened is that a lot of groundwater is drawn out for this. The rain patterns have changed due to climate change. And as a result of that, farmers are committing suicide today. I mean, just because we chose to consume rice from an area. So can we change these patterns is what I'm trying to bring up, so we connected these dots to ask the question that, can we question our own sort of patterns? Can we question our own choices and make this difference apart from whatever's happening at a government level?
Okay. Yet, and so many of you, whether, when Kamal was talking about disaster response, Mr. Vijay Kumar about farmers, you about farmers and urban centers, and yet the challenge is still so much larger. So I want to, in the last 15 minutes that we have, I want to bring the conversation back to the urgency of needing to do not just act, but do a lot more. So Sir David and Mr. Ravi Shankar Prasad, let me draw you both in first. A bunch of questions have come that are talking about, asking about the balance between large-scale carbon dioxide removal, as well as, afforestation or protecting the coastlines or marine life, etc. As the coastal mission that you were talking about, Mr. Ravi Shankar Prasad. How do governments, both of you have spent so many years in government, how do governments now balance between the large-scale carbon dioxide removal requirements, as well as the kind of rebuilding, regenerating the local ecosystems, when we are trying to come out of an economic crisis that the pandemic is posing to us? Maybe Sir David, first you, and then Mr. Prasad.
So let me start by responding to this very good question by saying what I did in the British government. Back in 2001, I initiated a foresight program into flood and coastal defenses for the United Kingdom. This was a very granular program in which we looked at the whole of the United Kingdom. We was a group of 120 experts drawn from a whole range of different expertise areas. And the report was fed, into it was fed the best climate models we had available to tell us out to 2080, under emissions proceeding as per expected as normal, what would be the challenges in terms of flooding for the UK? We are an island nation. When we have storms at sea, we have storms inland. We have simultaneous flooding from our rivers and attacks on our coastline. And so we made these predictions out to 2080, and then we put forward detailed proposals for action by the British government. And we said this is going to cost roughly £500 million a year initially, but it would have to rise depending on global action on reducing emissions. So we said by 2020, it should be 1 billion a year, but it would keep rising. And today, greenhouse gas emissions are still rising exactly as the model that we used in that period of time. So what I'm saying is there are significant, useful models that can be applied locally. These models have to be produced for each region of the world at a very small pixel scale. The big global models are operating at a pixel scale that's far too big for this kind of adaptation process. But do come to the British Met Office, where we have one of these models, and that model can be run for any small region of the world or any large region of the world. And the predictions for us have been very accurate. We had the biggest floods in our history, 2012-13, and that was not predicted to be at that point in time. We thought it might happen by 2020. This was an extreme weather event. What we put in place probably saved about 100 to 200 billion pounds in loss and damage. The total loss and damage in that flood was about £500 million. Right. So the action we put in place was far more valuable than we could have predicted. And this is the whole point about prevention and risk management. You really get a very big return on your investment.
Right. That's a great example. Mr. Prasad, your response?
Yeah, I think the way things are panning out, especially in countries like India, we are looking at large-scale changes in our CO2 emissions on account of shifting from fossil fuel-based energy sources to renewables. Not only talking about 175 gigawatts, but now looking at something like 450 gigawatts by 2030 or so. And at the same time, looking at changing the transportation patterns, looking at various changes that are coming in the agricultural sector itself. At the same time, we have been seeing the forest as net sinks, and about 12% of emissions of India are neutralized by the forest and tree cover that we have. And one of the things that we are looking at in this decade is to enhance these capabilities of the forest to sequester carbon dioxide to the tune of 2.5 to 3 billion tons of CO2 equivalent. At the same time, we also are looking at combating desertification. And there is a pledge, the bond pledge, which aims at 26 million hectares of area to be protected from land degradation and desertification. So there are huge long-term plans which are being unrolled, which are being put into practice. And as we know that apart from the government, it is also some of the changes that are happening at the local level. In fact, many of the districts in India now, not only the states have a state action plan of climate change, but the districts also have started having their own plans. And in many places, we see that the vulnerability and risk assessment have been made. There have been various studies which have gone into these issues. And coming back to one of the points that Ms. Sujatha made regarding the shifting of the cropping patterns, etc., that is something which has always been one of the issues that the policymakers have been grappling with. In fact, under a National Adaptation Fund scheme in Telangana, we have tried to, encourage farmers to shift to different patterns of cultivation, which is more friendly to the nature. Even in Punjab, there have been some attempts, but there's a lot of economics and there's a lot of profit and loss associated with the change in the cropping pattern, and it's a long-term, fight. It's a long-term strategy that will do the trick there. So all these things are happening in India, and as far as the government of India is concerned, we have a response in almost all sectors. We have strategies for almost all sectors, which are being undertaken in partnership with the state levels, and many of these getting executed at the sub-state levels themselves. Thank you.
Thank you. We have just 9 minutes left. And before the organizers kind of shut us off. So I'm going to turn to Mr. Kishore, Mr. Vijay Kumar, and Sujatha about how do you envision then between the kinds of, prevention is better than cure prescription that Sir David has been saying, the large-scale renewables energy efficiency, afforestation, coastal protection programs the government of India is projecting. How do you see this then informing the post-COVID economic recovery? Can we take this moment to turn our minds around as what is the kind of economy that we build or rebuild? Maybe Kamal, I'll go with you first.
Thanks, Arunabha. That's a very interesting question, and I will give you a rather discordant answer to that. The first thing is that what is becoming very clear is that, yes, prevention is better than cure, but it's almost too late. And we need cure as much as we need prevention. Our emergency response systems world over, in the disaster risk management community, we talk about this paradigm shift from relief and response to risk reduction and mitigation and all of that. But, that notional paradigm shift assumes that we've declared victory on the response side. But clearly, we are far from where we should be. Tell me one country which can claim that their emergency response systems are okay. So cure is as much needed as prevention. I think that paradigm shift is in crisis right now. So that's one thing I would say. The second thing I would say is that there are important good things happening. Sujatha talked about the joy of nature, but also see the nature of work has changed. Are we, once this thing is over, are we going to go back to carbon intensive? Would it change the debate on urban mobility in some fashion, or we'll go back to the same debate? So can we learn something from it? There are, in so many ways, things are working. I mean, we are having this conversation digitally. In government, we are doing e-files. the number of people coming to the offices is 30%, including in NDMA, yet the office is working, full steam.
Right. Right.
So there is something to be said about the future of infrastructure and resilient infrastructure. That brings me to our initiative on Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure. So what is it that we can learn from COVID-19 in terms of what is the future of resilient infrastructure? What would that mean in the post-COVID era in this thing? That's an open question, perhaps subject of another webinar. Thank you.
Sure. Mr. Vijay Kumar, Sujatha, very quickly, because I want to get a couple of last thoughts from Mr. Prasad and Sir David as well.
Yeah, so just very quickly, I'm building upon what Kamalji said, which is, about the fact that we've learned to live with less. We've learned to sort of cook more frugally. I think all of us within our homes are, eating more frugally. Some of us are growing things in our backyards, and we are all going back to nature. And I think that's a great learning. That's a positive learning from the pandemic. And I hope that we are able to sort of build upon this learning.
Thank you. Mr. Vijay Kumar?
I think, Arunabha, we need to take climate crisis even more seriously. It's, the livelihoods are at huge crisis, and we are not linking many things with climate change. We think individually they're acts of God or acts of nature. So somewhere I still feel we are not taking it seriously. So I would only say take it more seriously.
Fair enough.
And also that everybody counts. So I would I have my doubts on so-called billionaires finding solutions for us. And third point is learn from nature, do things which are in harmony with nature. Thank you.
Great points, Mr. Vijay Kumar. So final 2 minutes, Mr. Prasad and Sir David again. Can we get a significant share of the recovery packages that countries will come out with to focus on climate risks, climate action, and global cooperation? Mr. Prasad?
I think it will be difficult to answer this now, as we are still evolving our responses to the packages and how things are going to unfold. By and large, the contours that have been highlighted in different countries are designed sectorally, and their impact on the ground and how it imbibes the thoughts on climate change is something that we have to work on. And I think in the next few months, we'll be having a clearer picture on that. Thank you.
So, David?
I think the first thing I want to say very quickly is there are some countries that have led the way properly on this COVID-19 outbreak. Not Britain. We now have 50,000 fatalities in Britain. It's Greece, which has 150 fatalities, and Greece is now coming out of the outbreak. Greece was the model country stepping ahead as soon as the epidemic became known. Absolutely astonishing. And there they are, not a rich country in the European Union. The second thing I do want to say is that I would be very keen to speak to you, Ravi, Shankar, Prasad, after this has finished, to discuss how we might work together. I want to just come back to mission innovation. I came into the offices of your government in 2015, shortly after the election of the Modi government, and the response of Prime Minister Modi was simply superb to the idea of what was then Global Apollo Program and became Mission Innovation. He took it to the G20 after that, and this gave it the momentum that was needed to develop this $22 billion a year program, which has been so successful. I would love to see Prime Minister Modi once again take hold of this notion of climate repair and work with us to get a group of willing nations, and I think it could be the same willing nations, China, India, the group of nations covers a very wide range of emerging countries and the developed world. And together, I think we could manage these problems.
Thank you. Sure, we'll look forward to that.
Thank you.
Thank you. I have 1 minute left. And if you all recall, I actually never introduced the Council on Energy, Environment and Water. And that was intentional because I wanted our work to reflect through our partners. We've been privileged to partner with Sir David on climate risks. We've been privileged to partner with Mr. Vijay Kumar on regenerative agriculture. We've been privileged to partner with Mr. Kamal Kishore on looking at how do we build up the resilience of our disaster management infrastructure. We've been privileged to partner with Sujatha on getting the message out about climate risk to the wider population. And of course, we always are privileged to work with Mr. Ravi Shankar Prasad and Government of India and state governments on looking at enhancing climate action. But at CEEW, we believe that climate action alone is not going to be the answer. What we need is to square the potential impossible trinity of jobs, growth, and sustainability. People matter, as Mr. Vijay Kumar said. Economies matter. If the economies don't grow, we don't have the resources to rebuild the planet that we are on. And of course, sustainability matters for the environment, for finance, for society, and for politics. We have to begin to square this impossible trinity. We cannot just go with one. We cannot just go with two. We have to go with all three. So please join us in our efforts. Please partner with us. Thank you again to ICC for partnering with us on this particular webinar. I hope you enjoyed it. And I hope we'll see you many times more at conversations that we will lead. Thank you again to all the panelists for sharing your time and more importantly, your valuable thoughts with us. Amita.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ghosh. Thank you to this incredible and esteemed panel.